Hello everybody, welcome to the John Hewitt Digital Festival of Literature and Ideas for this In Conversation event with Eimear McBride. It was originally programmed to take place at the Marketplace Theatre and Arts Centre in Armagh as part of the John Hewitt International Summer School this year. Unfortunately, like so many festivals, the Summer School has been cancelled this year. But as it's hard to keep a good thing down, it's reinvented itself online as the Hewitt Digital Festival. And we're very thankful to funding from the Arts Council of Northern Ireland and Armagh City, Banbridge and Craigavon Borough Council for making this possible. I'm particularly excited about our conversation this evening because we get to have a chat with Eimear McBride. This is actually my third time in conversation with Eimear. I have been fortunate enough to get to speak to her about each of her three books, and I'm really excited to talk about Strange Hotel tonight. Eimear has read for the John Hewitt Society before at literary lunchtimes in the Ulster Hall, and the Hewitt Society has been dying to get her along to Armagh for the summer school for quite some time. So we're delighted when she agreed to come along this year, and it's been very, very good of her that she'd agreed to swap and come along to this digital event instead. Eimear, I'm sure, is very, very familiar to many of you. Her debut novel, A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, won the Bailey's Women's Prize for Literature, the Kerry Group Irish Novel of the Year, and the Goldsmiths Prize. Her follow-up novel, The Lesser Bohemians, won the James Tait Black Memorial Prize and was shortlisted for the Goldsmiths and the International Dublin Literary Award. Eimear, it's really, really lovely to be with you tonight. Before we get started, can you tell us how you are? How has lockdown been treating you?
You know, I think I've been one of the lucky ones because actually I spend most of my time shunning company and outdoor activities in favour of sitting at my desk and writing. So actually, I've just kind of had an intensification of what my life is normally like. So that's been pretty fortunate, although I have to accustom myself to spending more time with the other people who live in my house with me. But yeah, I mean, in terms of what other people have been going through, I've really not had a bad time.
And how's the writing been going for you in lockdown? A lot of writers said at the start it was very difficult to focus. Did you find that yourself?
I did, and also I got sick at the start, and that kind of knocked my concentration for quite a while, but I did get better eventually, and once I was able to think straight again, writing just seemed to start up again, and it's, I suppose, you know, it's helped to be able to just focus on something else for however many hours a day.
Do you think, I mean, a lot of us sometimes think that our writing is a cheap form of therapy. Do you think it has become that for a lot of us, something that's kept us seeing, and the familiarity of it has been good during this period?
I mean, I think it certainly doesn't hurt that if you are able to concentrate, and I know a lot of people also have had trouble with that, but if you are able to focus on your work, it does just provide some escape from everything else that's going on in the world.
We're going to be talking tonight mostly about Strange Hotel, which is a wonderful novel. I got to read it again just this week. I read it when it first came out, and it's a very recognisable portrait of hotel life. And I'm sure, like many writers, you have spent an enormous amount of time in hotels in the last wee while. I think it's quite interesting that, you know, this book's about hotels. There's actually a couple behind me, Lauren Vandenberg's amazing The Third Hotel, Will Wiles' The Way In, which are also exploring kind of this environment of the hotel and what it's like to be in hotels quite often. Can you tell us a little bit about where the idea for this book came from? What was the genesis of it?
Well, you know, as you say, I spent a lot of time over the last few years in hotels, and I suppose it, you know, when I first started to travel to festivals and, you know, things like that, I was quite excited, and, you know, it seemed very romantic to be traveling around the world and going to these hotel rooms, and I kind of go in and immediately want to look at what was in the minibar and what were the free toiletries you got, and, you know, it all seemed so exotic and exciting. But of course, after a while, it stops feeling like that, and everything looks the same and feels the same, and maybe the hotel is a bit better, maybe it's a bit worse, but it doesn't really matter, because all that counts is that you're not at home. And you're just away from everything. And then going to hotel rooms began to feel like dead time, where you just, you go and you wait to go to whatever it is that's the reason that you're in the hotel in the first place. And then you come back from that and then you wait to go home. And you're sort of thrown back on yourself in a very peculiar way, in a way that even if you're quite contemplative at home, it's different because you're in an environment that is full of natural distractions of, things either you feel you should do or things that you want to do. But in a hotel, there is nothing else. There's just you stuck in the place, belonging to no one and mattering to no one. Who lives or spends time in that hotel, who works in that hotel. You're just another face in another room whose sheets will have to be changed in the morning. And I suppose it was a kind of desire maybe to try and resurrect something from that kind of slightly deadening experience. And given that there was so much of it, there were so many hotels, I suppose I thought, well, can something be made from all this nothing? And that's where it began.
It's really interesting. I'm going to come back to that idea of the anonymity that comes from the hotel. And also, I'm so interested in almost a construction of self that you're able to practice in that space. But I think it'd be wonderful right now if you could just give us a wee snippet of flavour of the novel.
Yeah, I would love to. I'm going to read a little bit. So it's divided into long lists of different hotels, places where she stays in hotels, and then it kind of stops and the narrative comes in, and at this point it comes in at Austin. She opens the door. He says, "Can I come in?" She closes the door again. He manages a hold on before it shuts, but she, weightless in the width of shock, replaces the chain and turns the lock, then listens for his footfalls away. Upon hearing none, she admits harbouring some doubt that she would. So now, although she cannot be certain, she may reasonably deduce he is devising an alternative approach. She already knows she's miscalculated the outcome of this, and given her natural antipathy towards inconclusiveness, is irritated by having gotten it wrong. Also, and almost worse, where is the unruffable demeanour she's so painstakingly constructed? She'd appreciate it reasserting itself now. This angst is pointless, though, and wasteful, too. Take a breath, wait a beat. Self-reproach is a luxury for which she manifestly does not have the time. She really ought to be getting on with spreading the logic around. An untender resolve now is obviously all. Settle on the parameters of the decision, then make the choice. Even the wrong one would be preferable to this stalled botch. And if the scale of it appears unmanageable, just start small. Compartmentalise. She has already accomplished in this department after all, and may rely on it to stand her in good stead. So, should she spy through the spy hole? She has little stomach for that, the queasy fish-eyed reflection of her own anxious perspective. Also, she thinks she recalls a mention of his fondness for chess, not ostentatiously announced, but in reference to something else, so any such hackneyed move will have been anticipated unquestionably. Perhaps he even banks on it. She can't really imagine why, although he has certainly gone very quiet out there. In fact, now the only sounds filtering through seem to issue from the housekeeping staff beyond in the hall. Trolleys trundling, for instance, distant, discreet raps upon doors, apologies in various Latin accents of whose particular origin she remains unsure. Why didn't she study Spanish at school? Well, because there was only French, and even the French teacher had appeared unenthusiastic about imparting it. Never mind. It was the tenses she could never quite get. Never mind. And numbers above 60, who can keep track of all that? Never mind. The education system isn't on trial. Never mind. It doesn't matter. She's here now, so think. What is the reaction he might not expect? Well, and she realises this is weak, but in her graceless desperation, it's something at least, and in this way, a decision gets made. So, to thwart whatever advantage he imagines he's gained by his intemperate, unwarranted, overzealous display, she definitively turns her back on the spy hole and presses her spine to the wood. She is aware, as a countermove, this isn't much use, but in light of the previous paralysis, its impact is enormous. She can finally approve breathing out, and does, and looks around. Not a great deal of this room rejoins her to calm. She persists, however, until a quiet confidence arrives that she might, if only at some obtuse angle, have regained the upper hand. And if he doesn't realise she has, well, surely that's just greater proof. Take your triumphs where you find them, she thinks, especially when the thick of battle appears to be your only alternative. A little melodramatic, perhaps, but she gets her own point, and therefore lets the time slow down, sheathes the panic back under her skin, becomes a little more of herself again, and lets the room be what it is.
Thank you. You really want to do clapping at this point, but it doesn't work the same as in an online kind of setup. Even in that wee section that you read there, Eimear, there's a real sense of the kind of stasis and that the character, the protagonist, being quite stuck. And you get this cyclical thing. You mentioned the idea of, every hotel room looks similar no matter what city that you're in. And this idea of repetitiveness and stasis, do you think it's always a negative, tedious thing to be, in these spaces that feel so familiar over and over again? Or is there something comforting about that repetition?
Well, I think the protagonist certainly finds comfort in it, because I think, while perhaps for the reader, there's something quite frustrating about her inability to kind of open the narrative up and allow you into all the details. For her herself, there is a comfort in being in these anonymous places, in being, what she calls in this kind of time out of time, in these places where she is kind of feels safer from memory and safer from the grip of the past. And that's really what she's trying to avoid. So, for her, I think there's a constant battle over, allowing the past in and going to the next place that keeps the past out.
And do you think, you talked right at the beginning in your introduction of this idea of the hotel room as a kind of space outside of time, space outside of space almost. And we do have those places in our lives. Like, I always think about airports and departure lines and trains. And I've actually this afternoon I was just reading a Virginia Woolf essay where she talks about walking through London, and the moment that you leave your own house, you become almost anonymous and freed up by that, being in a space between spaces. Do you think that's the case with this protagonist?
I think it is, and being in those spaces, people's experiences can be almost interchangeable. How I experienced Stansted Airport is probably almost exactly the same as the way you experienced Stansted Airport. We probably do similar things in it, and it's there are no sort of great stories to be told about how we experience those places, and that the hotel room is a kind of a way that she is freed up from herself to sort of continue that idea of not having to be at the mercy of herself, of her own life. But of course, the converse side of it is an intensification of that, of being completely at the mercy of yourself, of not being able to think about other things, about having to constantly do battle with the one thing that you came there to not do battle with.
I want to pick up on this because I think my reading of the book has been really interesting, in that I read it back in February, just a few weeks before we went into lockdown. And in all honesty, it feels like a completely different book reading it this week. In a good way. It speaks very much to where we are now. And some of it is about this time outside of time thing that the last 4 months have felt like a space outside of space, where we've all had to do what this protagonist is doing, engage with all of the wee voices up here. Do you think there's a different reading to this book now than there was 4 months ago?
I think there certainly might be, because the book itself is quite, I think, claustrophobic, and I willed it to be that way. I wanted it to feel like, for the reader to feel kind of trapped inside this woman's psyche as she attempts to sort of overcome the past. So I think now, everyone having gone through this period of being intensely trapped and isolated with their own internal lives, I think there's, we're probably all the more equipped to understand the book, or to kind of see something perhaps more personal in it than may have felt like the case when it came out in February.
And I think that you've highlighted really well already the sense of it being both positive and negative. Like, I've found this period quite, in some ways, positive, that the rest of life stops and you can put all that scary stuff on pause for a while, but also terrifying because here I am with myself. I guess I wanted to talk to you a wee bit as well about public and private spaces, because it's another thing that I really enjoyed in Strange Hotel. I live in a terraced house, so any second now we might hear my neighbour's dogs or, the arthritic plumbing. There's such a sense of that in this novel. She hears the bumps and grinds and thumps and things of the people who are staying next door. Do you think there's a blurring between our public and private selves? And I'm thinking of this particularly in terms of being a writer, that you are asked to sit both outside an experience and also very much within it as well.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's kind of the common writer's complaint, isn't it, about approaching every aspect of life with a little chip of ice in your heart, because there's a part of you that, no matter how intense an experience might be, is always looking in and observing it and considering, the other interpretations and how that might be reshaped and reformed and retold. And I think for her, again, in the hotel, which is so private and yet so intensely, there's a scene where she gets really drunk and she watches some porn on TV and she falls asleep.
Yeah.
And she wakes up and realizes that it's really, really loud and that everyone must have heard it. And, and that idea of, even if everyone has heard it, what does it matter? But at the same time, the shame is the same, whether it was, people she knew or not. That there's that kind of burning problem with the fact that, I suppose that shame is also very little about really what other people think about you. It's about your own sense of having transgressed something and how you carry that with you, no matter really what the reaction of others is. And even if everybody goes, well, it's okay, don't worry about it. If you feel shame about it, that doesn't really diminish it. That continues on with you. And so those things which feel very public are also intensely private. And it's quite hard to separate them out, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic metaphor for what it feels like to be a writer all the time. Reading it, I was like, I can sense this claustrophobia, the desire to be present with the experience, but also outside it at the same time.
Yeah, and the kind of despair that attaches to that as well, the kind of the desire to be close to life and part of life, especially when you write, and what you want is to bring the reader in as close to the character's experience as possible. But it's also, I suppose, a kind of a cry for help or of complaint that you yourself can never get as close.
And I'm sure this is a common complaint with the book, but I can't help but reading her as a writer. Just because I know the frustration of being in travel lodges in Hull and just hearing everyone around you. Another thing, and you've touched on this already, but I want to talk about it a wee bit more, is the sense of her wrestling with her sense of self. I think that's a huge thing that goes the whole way through the book, and something I've been thinking about a lot this week. And connection. There's a sense that she's trying to connect. Do you think she's trying to connect with herself, or she's trying to connect with the wider world, the people around her?
No, I think she's going out of her way to not connect with other people. I think there was a time when she was very connected in her own life, and that time passed, and the person that she felt that with was lost to her. And she has never really had the will to put herself in that position again. And so I think she has a very natural human desire to connect with other people, but an intense reluctance because of her own life experience, to put herself in that position where she actually can. So she basically works herself into a position where she can't make any choices. She can't go forward, she can't go back, unless she makes a big change, unless she decides to make a really big change. She's sort of stuck. And so I think it's the two things are kind of grinding off each other all at once, that kind of the desire to connect and also the absolute horror of the thought of connecting.
Yeah. I've heard you talk about this. I think it was at Court, this idea of trying to remove yourself from writing too much about the emotional experience and to be very pragmatic and talk us through, you know, characters extremely self-aware. Can you tell us why you wanted to do that? I had a go at it, Eimear. I tried to write a short story like that, and it's really bloody hard to do.
Yeah, I suppose, you know, my first two books are very, I suppose, quite emotional, quite visceral, and, you know, readers tend to say that they have big reactions to them or big emotional experiences with them, which is great. And I suppose I wanted that with those books. But with this, and I suppose maybe of late, and also because, you know, those first two books are about very young women. Yeah. And about how when you're young, you kind of allow life you allow life inside and you allow it to affect you because you don't necessarily know the terrible things that it might do to you. But when you get older, you are much more aware of being, you know, the things that you don't want to get into, the conversations you just know that there's no point in having, the kind of the emotional entanglements which you understand are always going to end in disaster. And so, you know, I was very aware that I wanted to write a middle-aged woman, and how that would affect language, but also the fact that in middle age you're suddenly you put a barrier up and you don't necessarily allow other people to come across that line anymore. And I think in the bigger picture, I feel quite worn out by all the emoting that's going on in the world at the moment, that everyone's has decided that thought is of no merit, but feeling is all. And I think this is a really unhelpful, dangerous way to think about the world. And so I wanted to write a book that is about feeling, but is about a character thinking about feeling rather than simply experiencing feeling, and the troublesome nature of feeling, and that she is in a position where she is set back from the immediate kind of rush of emotion and is able to think about it and able to process it and make decisions about feeling, which of course we all are, but we're not particularly encouraged to do at this point in history. We're all supposed to, you know, have lots of feelings all the time, and I'm just kind of exhausted by it. I'm kind of sick of all my own feelings, and I'm definitely sick of everyone else's.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit, see if I can find it in my notes, because I love this quote, where you say to be alone in the head is bliss. And yet, you know, I have been alone in my head for the last 4 months, and it has been far from bliss at times. Yeah. I think that, you know, the nature of the world, as you've just said, is so emotion-filled at the minute. Actually being alone in your head can feel really exhausting all the time.
Yeah, but also, I mean, that aspect of the book is also about, you know, how she struggles with her own critic inside herself. And that, you know, how she kind of longs to be able to turn off the critic in her head, so she's not spending every moment double thinking and double guessing and taking a second take on everything that she thinks. Because I think that's, you know, it's a big problem for women particularly, where it's not enough that you just go through life experiencing life, but you are constantly aware of how you are being perceived for better or for worse, and what the judgments are, and that even when you're alone and there's nobody judging you, it's becomes so intrinsic to your nature that you do it to yourself, that you're judging and correcting and warning yourself against yourself. And, you know, and so, you know, when she says to be alone in the head is bliss, is really about that, about trying to reach a state where she's not kind of just always second guessing herself.
Yeah. And I one of the things I find really interesting is there's this second guessing and thinking about emotion, but there's also her second guessing and thinking about her physicality. There's a number of times where she almost narrates, my body is doing this, and questions why it's doing this. There's something there, I think, that's really interesting about how women see themselves, even physically as well.
Yeah, well, that we constantly sort of see ourselves as inside the suit of our bodies, rather than our bodies just being the physical manifestation of ourselves, as though somehow we're wearing something that we own but doesn't really belong to us, and that we are constantly trying to fix or be aware of or wonder how it's being received by the critics, instead of being a bit more fuck you about, well, whatever, this is my body, tough.
Yeah.
And I think, again, because the character is middle-aged like myself, I think she's also reached a point where she's a bit more, oh my God, I'm so sick of all of this. I'm so bored by all the ideas of what it's supposed to be like to be a middle-aged woman, how you are supposed to feel about yourselves, your body, the things that you're supposed to think are important, that you should be wasting your time on and preoccupying yourself with. And at the same time, of course, because she is self-aware, she is also aware that while she's telling herself that she doesn't care about these things, she knows that she's, she complains about seeing the woman putting on all this makeup in the lift mirror, but at the same time acknowledges that, she looks at herself in the mirror and that she has makeup bag in her bag. And, it's the kind of the endless sort of the inescapable bind of wanting to be on the outside of a culture that breeds insecurity, but of course inevitably never being able to be on the outside of your own culture, because there is only one culture, and so even if you reject it, you're still reacting to it.
I think it's such an honest portrayal of what it's like to be a woman. Like, it really, and I mean this in the kindest way, it both frustrated me immensely and really resonated with me as well. And one of this is a slightly more technical question, but your voice is such a strong thing in your work, and both of the previous novels are in the first. And I wondered if, because it's such a close, intimate reading of this woman's experience, was there nothing in you that thought, oh, I should write this in the first?
Well, it wasn't, I didn't set out to write this as my next novel, and I really started it just as a short story, which was kind of unusual for me because I never start short stories. I only ever write short story if someone says, will you write me a short story? And again, I didn't write a short story. I ended up writing a novel. But I think maybe because it was just supposed to be a short piece, I kind of thought, well, you never write in the third person. Why do you write in the third person and see what happens? And so I started, but I quickly realized that actually, although technically it is the third person, it's a cheat, because it's not a normal third person. It's actually a really close third person, and the third person is really her addressing herself. And then there are moments where it kind of slips, and she kind of falls into the first person and then recovers and pushes it away and goes back to the third person, this self that she's examining, that she's dealing with and wrangling with all the time. So it's, you kind of, as the reader, you're kind of allowed access in a way that a normal third person wouldn't give you. You know what's going on the inside of her, but the problem is you have to catch up all the time because she's just thinking. And so she's not telling herself her whole story. She's not recounting the tale all the time. She's just experiencing it and experiencing those thoughts and examining them, and the reader has to try and pick up the pieces and put them together and work out what it is that she's talking about, what's she referring to, why are we talking about this again? And so it's third, but it's a cheat. It's not really third.
I'm nodding like a crazy woman because I've been trying to write an essay on first person and empathy for the last 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And I had in my head that it was first person because that was the impression the first reading of the book gave me.
Yeah.
Then I went back and was like, oh shit, no, it's not. It's the third. And see, you know, as you're explaining it, it's a really tricky version of the third person, which has kind of given me a bit of hope for opening up the third person when I have a tendency to write in the third.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to jump onto something that you said there, which you may want to be evasive about. But the last time I had a chat with you, you had mentioned that, you know, you were working on a trilogy of novels about circling around the characters who were introduced to it at first in Girl. Is there a link to those characters? Do you know, is this Eileen and Stephen? Or feel free to be as evasive as you want.
I mean, I think the trilogy wasn't really supposed to include A Girl Is a Half-Formed Thing. And I really envisaged that I would write a much more straightforward kind of sequel to The Lesser Bohemians, which I would still really like to do because I'm still very interested in those characters. But I think there's a world in which you could read Strange Hotel as a kind of loose sequel if you wanted, and there's a reason why the character is never named, and that's one of the reasons, because I didn't really want to pin it down and have to make that choice and say, yes, this is Eileen 25 years later. But it could be, and obviously there are a lot of parallels between what she says, what she talks about in Strange Hotel, and things that happen in The Lesser Bohemians. And I suppose I just thought, well, I wrote all the books. Why shouldn't they be connected to each other? Yeah. I mean, they're all part of me in some way or another. And just as Eileen dreams about the girl in The Girl Is a Half-Formed Thing, so narrator from Strange Hotel she's a possible future Eileen, but we don't know. And also, I think just that the way in life, the way we sometimes try to imagine alternatives. What if I had turned left instead of right? What if I had gone out with this one instead of that one? What, you know, all of those, where would my life be? How would that have worked out? It was kind of fun to do that with a fictional character and not feel that I had to, because I feel very strongly about Eileen and Stephen. They're very important characters for me. And I want to do it right when I write another book about them. But Strange Hotel seemed like kind of fun way to imagine different alternatives to just do in the book, do for a fictional character what you do for yourself in your own life.
Yeah, I'm about to read Curtis Sittenfeld's reimagining of Hillary Clinton if she hadn't met Bill.
Yeah.
And it'd be interesting to see what she does with the reimagining of a real person. But I can definitely, I think there's that lovely thing that what you've given us in this book is an opportunity for the reader to make up their own mind. You know, you can choose to read it as linked to previous work, or you can choose to read it as a separate thing. And I really appreciate not being patronised by literature. So I think what you've done there is very kind and very generous to your readers.
Well, you know, it gets very annoying after a while. It's only being told what to do by writers. Sometimes to just kind of be left alone to make your own decisions. It's what as a reader, it's what I long for sometimes. I can't abide this kind of endless pushing of particular, like, you must look here, you must think this about what you see, and these are the conclusions you must arrive at. I think the time for that kind of writing is over, although I am perhaps alone in the world thinking that. But it's a kind of writing that I find kind of quite infuriating and, as you say, patronising, and it's not something that I want to do myself, if possible.
No, to me, like, when you begin to write a story, you don't really want to know where it's going to end up, and you don't even want to know when you finish writing the book where it ends up. There has to be a freedom for the reader to step in and interpret, or even you, like, you know, sometimes I'll come back to something I wrote 10 years ago and read it and it means something completely different. No, I think that's
absolutely. I mean, in a way, I don't think a book is finished until someone has read it. You know, and that other people will keep reading it means that it's always changing. And I think that is the case. And often, even with my own books, I've had, people kind of approach me to tell me about their various interpretations, and some of them I find completely infuriating, but also sometimes I think, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That wasn't what I intended, but I can see why you thought that, and I think that's a good thing. That means there's room for thought, and as readers, what we want to be doing is thinking, right?
Yeah.
We don't just want to be told how to think or what to believe or how to understand something, but to be allowed to engage ourselves.
Do you ever nick things that people say about your books that make them sound really clever and then pretend that's what you were thinking? I've never done that myself.
I do sometimes do that. I usually try and give credit and say someone said this to me. But yeah, I mean, of course, sometimes people say things and you think, oh, that's a really good way to put that. I'm going to use that one in future. So yeah, I mean, definitely. The moral thievery for sure.
I'm going to jump in here actually with a question from one of your fans who got in contact via Twitter. This is from Annie, and she wanted to ask particularly about your narrative style and that it's so distinctive. And she says, have you ever been tempted to write in a more traditional kind of voice?
Well, I suppose Strange Hotels sort of was my attempt to write in a more traditional voice, in that, the first two books, they have the kind of fractured syntax and that kind of stream of consciousness approach, and the language is broken and the punctuation is very idiosyncratic. And I suppose with Strange Hotel, I thought, okay, well, I'm going to write a book in which there is a capital letter at the start of the sentence, and there's going to be a full stop at the end of the sentence, and I may even use a semicolon now and then, which I have never used before. And so that was the rule, was that it had to be grammatically correct, really grammatically correct. And what was kind of interesting about that journey was that I realized how actually all of that doesn't really facilitate communication. It really only makes it worse. And that's why the book just ends up having all these really long, complex, reflexive, clause-ridden sentences, and which actually aren't any easier to understand, which actually require the reader to have to stop and do a bit of work on them. And that seemed kind of ironic to me, that having sort of been perverse and made language do whatever I wanted it by obeying all the rules, that didn't seem to improve matters much. Life still seemed to be completely elusive, even when you're trying to just share it in grammatical form. So that was my attempt at writing very, and when I wrote it first, I thought, okay, this is my very straight novel. This is the easy one, and no one was going to complain that, whatever they think of it, they're not going to complain that it's hard to read the way they complained about the other books. But actually, in some ways, I think it's harder to read and requires even more concentration than the first two books. So yeah, you mean you can't control it, clearly. I can't control it. It does what it wants.
No. Sure, you can only write the book that you can write. It's always going to come out of you.
Yeah, and if you're not writing that, then what are you doing? So,
yeah. Did you learn how to use a semicolon in the process?
I believe so. Though I'm still not sure of my... I'm not sure if I've used them all in the right way, but there are plenty of them in there. So,
I know, I just sort of fling them liberally at the prose and see where they land and go with it. And then the editor takes them all out and gives me off about it. I guess it would be really important. We're coming towards the end of the chat, and I wanted to just talk a little bit about the protagonist as a woman. She's a really interesting autonomous, a really interesting sense of her own autonomy, particularly when it comes to sex. I mean, I've looked it down here. She's definitely not into postcoital snuggling.
No.
And I've heard some people say that this is a strange portrayal of women or a shocking portrayal of women. Why would that be so? Like, why is it? What are people stretching to in this? I
mean, I don't think it is. I think I wrote her that way because I'm so bored with this traditional idea that sex particularly casual sex is total catastrophe for women, that it's indicative of some deep, spiritual, emotional malaise that all women really want is to be loved. And if they're shagging someone who doesn't love them, then there's something wrong with them. And I really don't think that that's the case. And I suppose I just wanted to claim back that area where women can just have sex with someone because they like them, because they're a bit bored, because they feel a bit lonely, because whatever, and it's not a catastrophe. And and she does it in the book. She picks men up and she has a nice time or not a nice time, and then just wants them to go so she can just get to bed and have a sleep. And I can imagine that for some people that is a very uncomfortable portrayal. And I certainly, in one of the few public events I did before lockdown, was confronted by a sort of astounded elderly man who demanded to know why had I objectified men in this book, which was, I thought, an interesting interpretation, just because the men were not considered to be important in the book. The book was about her and her experience, and so I don't know. I think it's also a woman thinking a lot, not having lots of feelings, a woman doing a lot of thinking, and using sex as a kind of a sort of a way of getting on with life, rather than it being the main event, rather than the thing that she feels she needs to have with someone who loves her and will change her. It just seemed kind of fun to go against all that, because I do think that's true. I don't think sex is a catastrophe for women all the time. And I'm sort of tired of that. And I think a woman who's just kind of doing her own thing, who's not, who's just not engaged with the whole culture of sex catastrophism, was an unusual move and perhaps a bit alarming for the elderly.
You're going to come with like a caution.
I'm waiting for it. I know it's going to come.
I'm going to finish up in a wee second with another reading, if that's okay. But I've got a couple more really quick wee questions for you before we finish up.
Yeah.
First one, and this is another one that came through from an online friend. This is a book about hotels. Eimear, what is your top tip for staying in a hotel? Because you've obviously stayed in lots of hotels. Do you have like a kind of life hack for staying in hotels?
Yeah, I have one of those little resealable airport plastic bags, and that's just always in my cupboard, and it's always got the mini basics in it, and that's what you need. That's all you need in the hotel room, I think. And you need it in your life so that you don't spend your time thinking about hotel rooms and what you need when you're in a hotel room. You just take it out when you come home and you put it in the cupboard and you don't touch it. And the next time you go out, you take it and go again. And I think, stay clear of the minibar. You should also have that written below the warning on your book. Eimear McBride says, stay clear of the minibar. Yeah.
Final question before we go into our last wee reading. I'm just really intrigued. I think it's 5 different cities you visit. Is it 5 or 6?
Well, it's 5, and then there's kind of imagined.
Yeah, there's an imagined itinerary of different places.
Yeah.
Are those all places that you have been to? And if so, why did you pick the 5 that you settled on to focus on?
Well, actually, the book itself contains all these lists of places, and all of those places are places that I've been. That's basically a list of every hotel room I've ever stayed in. Is the list that goes down, and so even the places that I pulled out and written, based the narrative in, are places that I've stayed. And I suppose on one hand, I chose each of those places because of a particular kind of atmosphere that I associate with those places, even though the hotel rooms are the same really everywhere. The hotel room in Oslo is probably pretty much the same as the hotel in Auckland, but the atmosphere of what she's experiencing in that particular time. That in Oslo, there's this kind of intense sort of sense of isolation. And I sort of associate that with the kind of light that you get in Oslo in the early morning. And so but also they're also kind of interchangeable. They can be anywhere. They probably could be anywhere, but personally for myself, I chose them for their own atmosphere.
And I know that you have, you're not overly fond of hotel staying, but is there one particular hotel in all of the hotels that you've ever visited you thought, actually, this one is really nice?
No. I mean, there have been some lovely hotel rooms, but I can't say there have been anywhere I just thought, I wish my sitting room was like this.
But we just lost our sponsorship opportunity, Eimear. Go out to Travel Lodge or something after this. Right. It'd be wonderful if you would give us another wee short reading before we finish up. And then I'm going to ask you one final questions after that.
Okay. So I'm going to read from the final section, which is called The Imagined Room, which is in the first person. A man told me a story, and it wasn't just a story, and he thought he would make me run. And if that ending to his story had proved to be the story, some choices are made only once, but that other path still reconsiders its merit within me now and then. My eye pressed to a spy hole in an unfamiliar hotel appears to be one such occasion. So she sees myself standing in an imagined hotel room, all arrayed like a Victorian bedchamber I've repurposed from some film. 4-poster bed and bolster, only bare bulb lit. An invented authenticity, but I am inventing this, so I can deck it out in any way I want. Conversely now, the real truth, it would have been my first hotel. If not the Savoy of my imaginings, he would have taken care to make it decent. He'd have been conscientious about that because I was so young, showing up there in the middle of the night, and then would have been staying on my own. I think he would have walked me to the foyer. He would have seen me in and ensured all the details were in order, breakfast ordered, payment taken, before taking his final leave of me at the lift doors or foot of the stairs. Would he have leant in to kiss my cheek goodbye? I can't imagine him having not, but if coming here was the choice I'd opted for, we would already have been different. And hard as it may be to gauge how we'd have introduced that space, this decisive going of our separate ways would certainly suggest a start. That said, now I'm in bed with the purely speculative. Any possibility might become fact. Therefore, continue on. Good night, and to you.
That's a really good place to finish off with. Thank you. Final sneaky last question. What are you working on at the minute? Are you allowed to tell us?
I've been working on a film script of an adaptation of Lesser Bohemians.
Oh, that's very exciting.
Well, it is long and slow, but who knows? Maybe one day it'll get made.
Okay, that's cheered me up immensely. Put aside all of the mention of the semicolons now. Eimear, it has been so lovely to chat to you this evening. It's almost felt like you're actually here in my dining room come study. So thank you so much for your readings and your insights. And I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of everyone else to say how much they've enjoyed their time with you this evening. The Hewitt Digital Festival bookseller is No Alibis in Belfast, and David will be more than happy to get you a copy of Strange Hotel or any of Eimear's other books, which are all wonderful. You can pre-order online or by phone, and now you can actually drop in and see David as well. If you've enjoyed this chat, it's the first of several fantastic digital events at the Hewitt Festival of Literature and Ideas. We've got the Poetry Gala coming up with Terence Hayes and Mona Arshey. We've got conversations with Michael Hughes and Donal Ryan about his latest novel, and a fantastic interview chat between Marisha Conlon McKenna and Martina Devlin. So make sure you don't miss those. I'm not too sure how we thank Eimear in this strange world, but I am giving her a digital round of applause now, and I hope that you are wherever you are as well. So raise a wee glass. Thank you so much for a lovely conversation, Eimear.
Thank you, Jan. It was great.